The cruelest lies are the ones dressed as truth. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble as laughter floated through the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate, every detail curated to perfection, every smile rehearsed, every glance measuring status and power, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore in a tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding, his expression composed, the image of a man who had everything exactly as he wanted it. The guests leaned in closer as he raised his glass, his voice smooth, deliberate, carrying easily through the room as if the air itself made space for him. "Tonight is about legacy," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, the kind that never quite reached his eyes, "about building a future that actually lasts." And the room responded with approving murmurs, soft applause, the sound of agreement from people who had built their lives around power and perception. Near him stood a woman in a pale gold dress, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, a symbol more than a person, a promise more than a partner. And just as the energy settled into something celebratory, something almost triumphant, Ethan tilted his head slightly toward the entrance and added, with a tone so casual it felt almost careless, "And of course, I thought it would be meaningful to invite someone from my past, someone who couldn't quite be part of that future." A ripple moved through the crowd. Curiosity sharpened into anticipation, and then he said it, softer this time, but sharper, "My ex-wife." And a few guests exchanged knowing glances, the kind that carried stories without words, stories of failure, of inadequacy, of quiet judgment dressed in polite silence. The doors at the far end of the room opened slowly, not with drama, but with a measured calm that seemed almost out of place against the polished spectacle inside. And she stepped in, Amara Collins, her presence quiet but undeniable, dressed in a simple black gown that didn't compete with the room but somehow commanded it, the fabric catching just enough light to reveal its depth, its strength, like armor that didn't need to shine to be seen, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the shifting weight of dozens of eyes trying to define her before she even reached the center of the room. And for a brief moment, something flickered in Ethan's expression, something almost like recognition, quickly buried beneath control. He smiled again, this time wider, colder. "Amara," he said, his voice carrying that same polished edge, "I appreciate you coming." The words sounded like courtesy, but the pause that followed turned them into something else entirely, something calculated, something meant to land. "I thought it would be fitting," he continued, "for everyone to see how far we've come." A few soft laughs echoed, light, restrained, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be understood. Amara stopped a few feet away, her hands relaxed at her sides, her face unreadable, and in that stillness, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything that would confirm the narrative already forming in their minds. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, watching her over the rim of the glass, measuring, expecting. "You look well," he added, almost as an afterthought, and for the first time, she spoke, her voice calm, even, untouched by the tension that seemed to press in from every direction. "I am," she said, nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of it cutting through the room in a way no raised voice ever could. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure why the moment felt different than they had expected, why it didn't quite follow the script they had already written for her. Ethan's smile faltered for the smallest fraction of a second before returning, sharper now, more deliberate. "I'm glad," he replied, setting his glass down with a quiet precision. "Because tonight is about new beginnings." His hand gestured lightly toward the woman beside him, toward the future he had chosen, the one he had displayed so carefully. About building something real, and the word real lingered in the air, heavy with implication, heavy with judgment. And yet Amara didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't defend. She simply stood there, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already moved beyond the moment that was meant to define her. And somewhere in the back of the room, the doors shifted again, a subtle movement, almost unnoticed, but enough to change the air, enough to introduce something new, something unexpected, something that didn't belong to Ethan's carefully controlled narrative. And though no one could yet see it clearly, though no one could yet understand what was about to unfold. There was a quiet certainty in the way Amara's gaze softened just slightly, not toward Ethan, not toward the crowd, but toward something behind her. Something that was about to step into the light and rewrite everything they thought they knew. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly like glass under pressure as the faint sound of small footsteps echoed across the marble floor, and one by one 4 children stepped into the light, each no older than 3 years old. Each dressed in soft, neutral tones that contrasted the opulence around them, their presence gentle, yet undeniable. The room shifted not loudly, but deeply. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Eyes moved instinctively from one child to the next, searching for difference, and finding none. The same dark hair, the same calm gaze, the same unmistakable resemblance that no amount of denial could erase. Ethan did not move at first. His body remained perfectly still, but his eyes betrayed him, narrowing slightly, then widening as recognition crept in. Uninvited, unwanted, unstoppable. The woman beside him stiffened, her hand slowly retreating from his arm, as though the connection itself had become uncertain, fragile, something that could no longer hold its shape under the weight of what was unfolding. Amara did not turn immediately. She allowed the moment to breathe, allowed the truth to enter the room before she claimed it. Her fingers relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if she had carried this exact moment within her for years, shaping it, refining it, until it no longer belonged to pain, but to clarity. One of the children reached her first, a small hand slipping into hers with quiet familiarity, and that single gesture broke whatever illusion remained. The room no longer saw a woman alone. They saw a mother, complete, unshaken, undeniable. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped, as if the distance between them had suddenly expanded into something far greater than a few feet, something measured not in space, but in consequence. His voice, when it came, was lower than before, stripped of its practiced ease. "What is this?" he asked, though the question lacked force, lacked authority. It sounded less like a demand and more like a man trying to find footing where there was none. Amara finally looked at him fully, her gaze steady, not cold, not warm, simply certain. "This," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on the child beside her, "is what you said I could never give you." No accusation, no raised tone, just truth delivered with precision, the kind that did not need emphasis to be felt. A murmur spread through the guests, faster, now sharper. Names were not spoken, but the implication traveled clearly from one face to another. Ethan Whitmore, the man who had built his empire on certainty, now stood confronted by something he had dismissed too quickly too completely. His jaw tightened, his composure attempting to reassemble itself. "That is not possible," he said, though the words lacked conviction even to his own ears. "We were told." He stopped the sentence unfinished, the memory of sterile offices and quiet conversations flickering behind his eyes. Amara tilted her head slightly, not in mockery, but in quiet acknowledgement. "Yes," she replied, "you were told." The pause that followed carried more weight than anything she could have added, because within it lived every choice he had made, every moment he had chosen belief over trust, control over patience. The children remained close to her, their presence calm, unaffected by the tension that filled the room. One of them looked up at her and smiled, a small, simple gesture that grounded the moment in something real, something beyond judgment, beyond performance. Ethan noticed it, his gaze drawn to that smile, then back to Amara, as if searching for a version of the past that might still explain this, but there was none left, only what stood before him, now undeniable, complete. The woman in the gold dress shifted again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan," she said, but even that single word seemed to distance itself from him, as if it no longer belonged to the certainty she had once felt. The carefully curated celebration around them began to unravel, not through chaos, but through awareness. Glasses lowered, conversations halted, the illusion of control dissolved quietly in the presence of something more powerful than status or narrative. Truth did not need volume, it only needed to be seen. Amara took a single step forward, not toward Ethan, but past him, her movement measured, deliberate. The children followed, without hesitation, their small footsteps echoing softly in rhythm behind her, and in that moment the entire room understood something that could not be undone. This was not a return, this was a revelation. Ethan turned slightly as she passed, his hand lifting instinctively, as if to stop her, to hold on to something slipping beyond his reach. But he did not touch her, he could not, because the distance between them was no longer physical, it was absolute. And as she moved through the crowd, untouched, unchallenged, the air seemed to shift around her, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer needed to. And behind her, Ethan Whitmore remained exactly where he was, a man surrounded by everything he had built and confronted by everything he had chosen to lose. The doors closed behind Amara without a sound, yet the silence they left behind felt louder than anything that had filled the room before it. Pressed against the walls, settled into every corner, and refused to leave. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the space where she had been, as if the air itself might reverse and bring her back, but it did not. Reality held its ground. Unyielding, the guests shifted uneasily, their polished confidence replaced with something uncertain, something fragile. No one reached for their glasses, no one resumed their conversations, because there was nothing left to celebrate, not in the way they had planned. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand moving to straighten his cuff, a small, controlled motion, the kind he had relied on for years to maintain composure in rooms far more hostile than this. But this was different. This was not business. This was not strategy. This was something he could not negotiate or outmaneuver. The woman in the gold dress stepped back another inch, her posture no longer aligned with his, her earlier certainty dissolving into quiet distance. "You did not tell me this," she said, her voice careful, but edged with something sharper than curiosity. Ethan did not look at her immediately. His focus remained forward, as if turning away would make the moment more real. "There was nothing to tell," he replied, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. She let out a soft breath, not quite disbelief, not quite disappointment, but something in between, something that suggested the foundation she had trusted was no longer steady. "For children do not appear out of nothing, Ethan," she said, and this time he did turn, his expression tightening. Not in anger, but in something far more controlled, far more dangerous. "Enough," he said quietly, and the word carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was final. The room reacted to that tone, instinctively stepping back from the center of tension, as if distance could shield them from the shift that had taken place moments ago. Ethan reached for his glass again, but paused before lifting it, his reflection caught in the polished surface of the table beneath it, sharp, composed, unchanged, and yet entirely different, because now there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before, something unsettled, something aware. The image of the children replayed in his mind, not as a shock now, but as a pattern, their features, their expressions, the quiet way they had followed her, without hesitation. There had been no confusion in them, no uncertainty. They had known exactly where they belonged, and that certainty struck deeper than any accusation could have. He set the glass down without drinking and turned toward the nearest guest, offering a brief nod, a gesture meant to restore order, to reclaim control. But the response he received was not the same as before. It was slower, more measured, as if everyone in the room was reassessing the man they thought they understood. Across the space, a group of executives exchanged quiet words, their attention no longer focused on the event, but on him, on what this meant, on what it revealed. Reputation did not shatter in a single moment. It shifted gradually, and he could feel that shift beginning to take hold, subtle but undeniable. The woman beside him crossed her arms lightly, her gaze moving toward the exit where Amara had disappeared. "Are they yours?" she asked, and this time there was no softness left in her tone, only directness, only truth. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, not because he did not understand the question, but because he understood it too well. The answer formed without resistance, without calculation. "Yes," he said simply, and the words settled between them, heavier than anything that had come before. She nodded once, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming something she had already begun to suspect. Then she stepped away, not dramatically, not with anger, just distance, chosen deliberately, the kind that did not invite explanation. Ethan watched her go, but did not follow, because there was nothing he could offer that would restore what had just been undone. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention drawn again to the doors, the same doors that had opened so quietly and changed everything beyond them. Somewhere out of sight, Amara was walking away with 4 lives that carried his name, whether he claimed them or not. And for the first time since he had built his empire, since he had mastered control over every variable he could predict, he found himself facing something that did not respond to power, something that could not be rewritten or dismissed. The past was no longer behind him. It had stepped forward, taken form, and left on its own terms. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, to recover its movement, its noise, its surface-level composure, Ethan Whitmore stood in the center of it all, understanding with a clarity he could not ignore that the narrative he had built so carefully had just been rewritten without his Permission, and there was no version of control that could take it back. The night air outside the Whitmore estate felt cooler than it should have as Amara stepped onto the stone driveway, the distant hum of the city stretching beyond the gates like a quiet promise. The four children moved with her naturally, their small hands finding hers or the edge of her coat, without hesitation, without fear, as if they had always known exactly where to stand in a world that had once tried to deny them. She paused for a moment, not to look back, but to breathe, to let the weight of what had just happened settle into something steady, something owned. The driver opened the door of a black SUV parked beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights, and she guided the children inside one by one, each movement calm, deliberate. The youngest looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Is that man the one from the picture?" the child asked softly, and Amara's expression shifted just slightly, not with pain, but with recognition of a question that had been waiting its turn. She crouched down, so their eyes were level, her voice gentle, measured. "He is someone from before," she said, choosing truth without giving it power. The child nodded, accepting the answer without needing more, because children understood presence more than history. They knew who stayed, who showed up, who held their hand when it mattered. She closed the door carefully and slid into the seat beside them, the interior quiet, the world outside already beginning to fade as the vehicle pulled away from the estate, the lights behind them growing smaller with every passing second. Inside the ballroom, Ethan remained where he had been, though the energy around him had changed completely. The music resumed eventually, but it sounded distant, disconnected from the room, as if it no longer belonged to the people standing beneath it. Conversations returned in fragments, cautious, controlled, no longer centered on celebration, but on analysis, on interpretation, on the subtle recalibration of status that followed any unexpected shift. Ethan moved through it all with practiced ease, nodding, acknowledging, maintaining the surface he had built over years, but beneath it something had fractured, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. His assistant approached with a tablet held discreetly at his side. "Sir, the board members have begun to ask questions," the man said quietly, careful to keep his tone neutral. Ethan took the tablet without looking at him, his eyes scanning the brief updates, already forming a narrative he had not approved. Investors requesting clarification, rumors beginning to circulate, digital whispers moving faster than any controlled statement could contain. He handed the tablet back just as smoothly. "Prepare a statement," he said, his voice steady. "No speculation, only facts." The assistant hesitated for half a second. "And the children, sir?" Ethan paused, not because he lacked an answer, but because for the first time the answer was not a strategy, it was a reality. "They are mine," he said simply, and the words settled with a weight that did not invite further discussion. The assistant nodded and stepped away, leaving Ethan alone again in a room that no longer felt like his domain. He turned toward the large windows that overlooked the estate grounds, the darkness outside reflecting his image back at him, not distorted, not unclear, just present. The same man, yet not entirely the same, because now there was context, now there was consequence. Miles away, the city lights traced patterns across the glass as Amara watched them pass, her reflection faint beside them. The children had settled into quiet conversation among themselves, their voices soft, blending into a rhythm that felt like home. She rested her hand lightly against the seat, grounding herself not in what had happened, but in what came next, because this had never been about proving anything to Ethan. It had never been about returning or reclaiming. It had been about truth arriving on its own terms and leaving the same way. One of the older children leaned slightly against her shoulder, their voice thoughtful. He looked surprised. Amara allowed herself a small breath, almost a smile, not of satisfaction, but of understanding. "Sometimes people only see what they are ready to see," she said, her gaze steady on the road ahead. The vehicle moved forward smoothly, uninterrupted, the past now behind them, not erased, but placed where it belonged. And in the quiet space that followed, there was no need for explanation, no need for closure, because some moments did not require resolution. They simply revealed what had always been there, waiting to be seen. And for the first time in a long time, Amara Collins did not feel like she was walking away from something. She felt like she was moving fully into something that had been hers all along. Morning arrived without announcement, the kind that slipped quietly through floor to ceiling windows, painting soft lines of light across polished wood and still air. Amara stood in the kitchen of her penthouse apartment, barefoot, grounded, a ceramic mug warm between her hands as the city stretched below her, not distant, not overwhelming, just present. The Children's laughter drifted in from the living room light, unforced the sound of something whole, something untouched by the weight of last night. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to center, because peace did not come from forgetting, it came from choosing what stayed, and what no longer had permission to follow her footsteps approached, small and familiar, one of the children appearing at her side, their hair slightly tousled, their voice still carrying. "Sleep, are we going to school today?" The question, simple, anchored in routine and normalcy. Amara opened her eyes and looked down at them, a softness in her expression that did not weaken her strength, it completed it. "Yes," she said, gently brushing a strand of hair away from their face. "Life keeps moving forward." The child nodded, satisfied by the answer, because children understood continuity better than adults. They did not dwell where they were not held, they moved where they were seen. In another part of the city, Ethan stood alone in his office, the skyline behind him sharp against the morning light, his jacket draped over the back of his chair, his tie loosened, not carelessly, but without the usual precision. His desk was organized, as always, every document aligned, every detail controlled, yet the stillness in the room felt different, not productive, not strategic, just quiet. His phone buzzed again, another notification, another request, another question that did not ask directly, but demanded clarity. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, then set it back down unanswered, because for the first time responding did not feel like control, it felt like reaction, and he had built his life on never reacting impulsively. He moved toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, a man who had always been certain of his direction, now standing in a moment that required something else, something unfamiliar. His mind replayed the night, not as a single event, but as fragments, the doors opening, the children stepping forward, the way they had not looked confused, not once, the way Amara had spoken, without raising her voice, without seeking approval, without asking for acknowledgement, and the realization settled deeper with each repetition. She had not come back for him. She had come to show him what he had chosen not to see. His assistant entered quietly, pausing just inside the doorway. "Sir, the statement is ready for your approval." Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still fixed on the city, as if the answer might be written somewhere within its movement. "Send it," he said finally, his voice even controlled, but lacking the sharp edge it once carried. The assistant hesitated just slightly. "There is also a request from legal regarding acknowledgement and next steps." This time Ethan turned, his expression composed, but not untouched. "Schedule a meeting," he replied. "No delays." The assistant nodded and exited, leaving the door slightly ajar, a small imperfection in an otherwise perfect space that did not go unnoticed. Across town, Amara walked beside her children as they entered the private school courtyard. The morning air crisped, the energy around them filled with movement, parents greeting teachers, children finding their places within familiar rhythms. There were glances. Of course there always were, but they did not linger, they did not define the moment, because presence spoke louder than assumption. One of the teachers approached with a warm smile. "Good morning," she said, kneeling slightly to greet the children by name, each one answering confidently, stepping into their day, without hesitation, without doubt. Amara watched them go, not with worry, but with certainty, because she had built this not in response to loss, but in alignment with truth. Her phone vibrated softly. In her hand, a message displayed on the screen, unfamiliar number, yet expected. She looked at it for a second, longer than necessary, then locked the screen, without opening it, not out of avoidance, but out of choice. Some conversations required timing, not urgency. She slipped the phone into her bag and turned toward the exit. Her steps measured her pace, unhurried. The city moved around her, unchanged, yet entirely different, because she was no longer moving within it the same way. Somewhere behind her, a story had shifted, not because it demanded attention, but because it had finally been seen. And as she stepped into the light of a new day, there was no need to look back, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer held the authority to define what came next. The message did not disappear, it remained there, quiet, persistent, on Amara's phone screen long after she had chosen not to open it the first time. The weight of it not in its words, but in what it represented, a past that had finally learned how to reach her without control. She sat in a small corner cafe, not far from the school, her coffee untouched in front of her, the steam slowly fading into the morning air as the city moved around her with its usual rhythm, unaware that something far more personal was unfolding within the stillness she had created. She unlocked her phone, not out of hesitation, but with intention, her fingers steady as she opened the message. There was no greeting, no attempt at familiarity, just a single line, direct, precise. "We need to talk." She read it once, then again, not because it was complex, but because it was simple, and simplicity carried its own weight. She placed the phone down gently beside her cup, her gaze shifting to the window where reflections of passing lives blurred into motion, people walking, conversations happening, moments beginning and ending without pause. The world did not wait for clarity, it moved regardless. And that truth grounded her more than anything else. Across the city, Ethan sat at the long conference table, the room filled with advisors, legal representatives, and executives, all waiting for direction, all watching him with a new kind of attention, not admiration, not certainty, but calculation, the kind that measured risk rather. Then power documents were spread before him, contracts, projections, timelines, each one outlining a future that now required adjustment. His legal counsel spoke in a calm, controlled tone, outlining options, responsibilities, implications, words that were designed to structure reality into something manageable, something contained. But Ethan listened without interruption, his hands resting flat against the table, his posture unchanged, and yet something about him had shifted, something that could not be documented or negotiated because it was not external, it was internal. One of the advisors leaned forward slightly. "The sooner this is addressed publicly, the better," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Control the narrative before it controls you." Ethan's gaze moved to him briefly, then back to the documents in front of him. "It is not a narrative," he replied, his voice even, but carrying a weight that redirected the room. "It is fact." The distinction landed differently than anything else that had been said because it removed strategy from the equation and replaced it with something far less flexible. Truth did not adapt to perception, it existed regardless of how it was received. The room fell into a brief silence as that realization settled among them, a shift not just in the situation, but in the man they were accustomed to advising. He closed the folder in front of him, the sound quiet but decisive. "Schedule the meeting," he said. Today, no one questioned which meeting he meant because they all understood this was no longer about business. This was about something that existed beyond contracts and influence. Back at the cafe, Amara lifted her cup finally, taking a small sip, the warmth grounding her in the present, not the past, not the anticipation of what might come next, but the moment she was in now. Her phone remained beside her, the message still open, unchanged. She did not rush to respond because urgency belonged to those who feared losing control, and she no longer lived in that space. After a few minutes, she picked it up again, her fingers moving across the screen with quiet certainty. "You can talk," she typed, then paused, not searching for the right words, but deciding how much space to give something that no longer defined her. "I will listen," she added before sending the message, her tone measured, not inviting, not dismissive, simply clear, the kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly where she stood. She placed the phone back down and finished her coffee, the decision already made, not about whether she would see him, but about how she would stand when she did. Outside the cafe, the city continued its steady motion, cars passing, footsteps echoing, voices blending into the background of a world that did not stop for anyone. Yet within that movement, a different kind of stillness had formed, one that belonged to her, one that could not be disrupted by a message or a memory or even the man who had once held a place in her life that he could never return to. And as she stood to leave, the sunlight catching briefly on the glass around her, she did not feel like she was stepping into a confrontation. She felt like she was stepping into a conversation that would finally exist on equal ground. The meeting was set for late afternoon in a private lounge high above the city, where glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling and the skyline reflected back in sharp, clean lines that made everything feel exposed, even when it was meant to feel exclusive. Amara arrived first, not early, not late, just exactly when she intended to. The hostess greeted her with quiet respect, leading her to a table positioned near the window, where light softened the edges of everything without dimming the truth. She sat with composed ease, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture grounded, not guarded, because she was not here to defend anything. She had already lived through that part of her life. The server approached, offering water, which she accepted with a small nod, the simple act anchoring the moment in something ordinary, something real. Outside the glass, the city moved with its usual rhythm, cars flowing like quiet streams, people crossing intersections without hesitation, unaware of the shift that was about to happen. Inside a room built for conversations that carried weight, Ethan entered without announcement, his presence recognized before it was seen. The subtle change in the room, the way attention adjusted, not dramatically, but instinctively, he walked toward her with measured steps, his suit impeccable, his expression controlled, but there was no performance in his eyes this time, no calculated distance, only something quieter, something that had not existed before awareness. He stopped a few feet from the table, not sitting immediately, as if giving the moment space to define itself. Amara looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without invitation, simply acknowledgement. He took the seat across from her, the distance between them small in measurement, but significant in meaning. For a few seconds neither spoke. The silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, just present, like a line drawn clearly between past and present. Ethan was the first to break it, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual authority. "Thank you for coming." He said the words simple but deliberate. Amara inclined her head slightly. "You said you needed to talk," she replied, her tone even neither warm nor cold, just steady. He exhaled softly, as if releasing something he had held longer than he realized. "I did," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to her. "I owe you more than an explanation." She did not respond immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she did not rush into spaces that once demanded too much of her attention. "Then say what is true," she said finally, and the words settled between them with clarity. No room for deflection, no space for performance. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, his fingers still not tapping, not moving, just present. "I believed what I was told," he began. "I accepted it without question because it fit the outcome I thought I needed." His voice did not rise, did not shift into defense. It remained level, grounded in something that resembled accountability more than justification. "I did not ask for a second opinion. I did not ask how it could be wrong. I did not ask you what you felt or what you knew." Amara's gaze remained steady on him, not interrupting, not softening, just listening the way she had said she would. "You made a decision," she said quietly, and he nodded once. "Yes," he replied. "I made it quickly, and I made it final because it was easier to close a door than to question what stood behind it." The honesty in his words did not seek sympathy. It did not attempt to rewrite the past. It simply placed it where it belonged, between them, visible, undeniable. She reached for her glass, taking a small sip of water before setting it down again, her movements calm, unhurried. "And now?" she asked, not pressing, not leading, just allowing the question to exist. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring something that could not be quantified. "Now I understand what I walked away from." He said the words quiet, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. "And what I failed to recognize when it mattered." Amara considered that for a brief moment, not searching for meaning, but recognizing it. "Understanding does not change what happened," she said, and there was no sharpness in her tone, only truth. He nodded again, this time slower. "I know," he replied, "but it changes what I do next." The statement lingered in the space between them, not as a promise, not as a request, but as something unfinished, something that had not yet taken shape. Outside the window, the light had begun to shift the city, moving from afternoon into evening, the reflections on the glass growing deeper, more defined. And in that quiet transition, neither of them looked away, because for the first time the conversation was not about what had been lost, it was about what would be acknowledged moving forward, and neither of them intended to let that moment pass without seeing it clearly. The light outside the glass walls shifted slowly from gold to a deeper amber as the city prepared for evening, and inside the quiet lounge the air between them remained steady, not fragile, not charged, just clear. Amara leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, but intentional, as if she had already decided how much of this moment she would carry forward and how much she would leave exactly where it belonged. Ethan watched her, not with the intensity of control, but with a kind of focus that came from understanding that this was not a negotiation. There were no terms to adjust, no outcomes to secure, only truth to face and accept. "What do you want from this?" he asked finally, the question simple but layered, not a demand, not even a request, just an attempt to define the space they were now standing in. Amara did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting briefly toward the window, where reflections of passing headlights traced quiet lines across the glass like movement without destination. "I am not here to want anything from you," she said, her voice even calm, not distant, just grounded in something that no longer depended on him. "I came because you said you needed to speak, and I chose to listen." The distinction settled between them with quiet precision, removing expectation, removing obligation, leaving only choice. Ethan nodded once, slowly absorbing that, not resisting it, not trying to reshape it. because he could feel that doing so would only push the moment further away from anything real. "Then let me be clear," he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands now resting on the table, no longer held back, no longer distant. "I want to be present in their lives." The words came without hesitation, but without force as well, not an assertion of right, but an acknowledgement of responsibility. Amara's expression did not change immediately, but something in her eyes sharpened, not in defense, but in evaluation. She held his gaze for a moment longer than before, not searching for sincerity, but measuring consistency. "Presence is not a statement," she said quietly. "It is a pattern." The words landed without harshness, but with undeniable weight, because they were not meant to challenge, they were meant to define. Ethan exhaled softly, as if that truth had already begun to settle into him before she spoke it. "I understand that," he replied, "and I know I have not earned it." There was no hesitation in the admission, no attempt to soften it, because he understood now that clarity did not need comfort. Amara reached for her glass again, her movements unhurried, as if she was allowing the moment to breathe before deciding what came next. "They have a life," she said, "a rhythm, a structure, people they trust." Her voice remained steady, not protective in a defensive sense, but anchored in reality. "You do not step into that, because you realize something late." Ethan listened without interruption, his posture, still, his focus unwavering. Because for the first time he was not trying to lead the conversation, he was allowing it to show him where he stood. "Then tell me how," he said, and this time there was something different in his tone, not authority, not even certainty, just willingness. Amara considered him for a moment longer, the silence stretching not uncomfortably, but intentionally, as if the space itself was part of the answer. "You start small," she said finally. "Not with them, with yourself." The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything complex could have. "You show consistency where no one is watching, you follow through where there is nothing to gain, and you do it long enough that it stops being effort and becomes who you are." Ethan absorbed that, his gaze lowering briefly to the table before returning to her. And then he asked quietly. Amara's expression softened just slightly, not with emotion, but with recognition of a process rather than a moment. "Then we see what remains," she said, not promising, not denying, just leaving the outcome open to what would be built, not what would be claimed. Outside the window, the city had fully shifted into evening, lights stretching across the skyline, reflections doubling in the glass, creating layers of movement that blurred what was real and what was reflected. And yet inside the room, everything remained clear, defined, grounded in words that did not need repetition. Ethan leaned back again, his posture no longer rigid, no longer controlled in the way it had been before, because control was no longer the objective, understanding was. And for the first time, he was not measuring the outcome, he was recognizing the path. "I will do that," he said, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a statement he intended to carry forward regardless of whether it was seen. Amara nodded once, acknowledging the words without attaching expectation to them, because she had learned long ago that words only mattered when they were repeated in action. She stood then, not abruptly, not to end the conversation, but because it had reached its natural conclusion. There was nothing more to define in this moment, nothing more to extract or explain. Ethan remained seated for a second longer, watching her as she gathered her bag, her movements calm, unchanged, as if this conversation had not unsettled her, because it had not. She had already moved through the part of her life that required resolution. This was simply recognition. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said, her voice steady, not final, not open, just complete. And as she turned and walked toward the exit, the reflection of her figure moving alongside her in the glass, he did not stop her, did not call her back, because for the first time he understood that what mattered now was not what he said in this room, but what he would do long after she had left it. The city did not slow down for reflection, but Ethan did. The next morning his office remained unchanged, the same glass walls, the same skyline stretching endlessly beyond his reach. Yet something within the space felt different, not because the room had shifted, but because he had his routine began the same, as always, reports reviewed, calls scheduled, decisions made, but each action carried a weight that had not been there before, not pressure, not urgency, but awareness. He signed documents without hesitation, spoke in meetings without pause, but between those moments there were pauses that did not exist in his life before, small spaces where thought replaced instinct, where certainty gave way to consideration. His assistant entered mid-morning, placing a folder on his desk. "The revised statement has been approved by legal and communications," She said, her tone professional. Measured. Ethan glanced at it briefly, then closed the folder without reading it fully. Release it, he said simply, because the narrative was no longer something he intended to control. Beyond acknowledging what was real, the assistant hesitated for a second. There are also inquiries regarding personal involvement and future plans, she added carefully. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze moving to the window again, not avoiding the question, but reframing it internally before answering. They will be addressed when there is something real to say, he replied, and that answer carried more finality than any prepared statement could have across. Amara moved through her day with the same steady rhythm that had defined her life for years. Meetings, scheduled projects, reviewed decisions made not out of reaction, but out of intention. Her office overlooked a different part of the city, less imposing, less polished, but equally alive. Her work had never relied on image. It had been built on consistency, on quiet strength, on showing up long before recognition followed, and that foundation did not shift because of one conversation, one revelation, or one man's realization. Her phone buzzed once, then again. Messages from colleagues, from acquaintances, from people who had seen the headlines and drawn their own conclusions. She did not open them immediately, because her life was not defined by their curiosity, it was defined by her choices. She finished her meeting first, closed her laptop, then allowed herself to look at the screen briefly. The words varied in tone, in intention, in assumption, but they all pointed toward the same thing: attention. She locked the phone again, placing it face down on her desk, because attention was not the same as importance. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood outside the school grounds, his car parked across the street, not hidden, but not positioned to be noticed either. He remained inside at first, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the entrance, where children would soon begin to emerge. There was no schedule for this, no appointment, no formal introduction, just a decision made quietly, carried out without announcement. The school doors opened, and the courtyard filled with movement, parents greeting children, laughter echoing lightly through the air. Ethan did not move immediately. He watched, not searching, not expecting, just observing the way the children interacted, the way they moved, with familiarity, with trust. And then he saw them, the four small figures stepping out together, their presence unmistakable, not because of resemblance alone, but because of the way they held themselves, grounded, connected, aware of each other in a way that required no explanation. One of them pointed towards something in the distance, another laughed, the sound carrying faintly even across the street. And for a moment Ethan did not see what he had lost, he saw what existed independently of him, something whole, something that had never needed his permission to be real. Amara appeared moments later. Her steps measured, her attention focused on the children, not scanning the surroundings, not anticipating interruption, because she had built a life that did not revolve around unpredictability. Ethan opened the car door, then paused, one foot on the pavement, his hand still resting on the frame of the door. The moment balanced between action and restraint, and in that pause he remembered her words: presence is a pattern, not a moment. He closed the door again, gently, remaining where he was, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because this was not the place to step forward, not yet, not without the consistency she had spoken of. He watched as they walked away together, their movements aligned, their pace unbroken, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to interrupt that rhythm. He felt the need to earn the right to be part of it. And as the car engine remained silent and the afternoon light shifted slowly across the street, Ethan Whitmore understood that what lay ahead was not a single decision or a single moment. It was something far more demanding, something that required time, patience, and a version of himself that he had never been asked to become until now. Days did not announce change, they revealed it quietly, in repetition, in choices made when no one was watching, in moments that held no audience and demanded no recognition. Ethan returned to the same street outside the school more than once, never at the same time, never in a way that would be predictable. His presence remained distant, not hidden, but not intrusive, a pattern forming slowly, without expectation. He watched the rhythm unfold, children arriving, leaving, laughter echoing across the courtyard, the same four figures, always moving together, always anchored by a sense of belonging that did not waver. And each time he remained in his car, hands still, posture composed, not because he lacked the courage to step out, but because he understood now that timing was not something he could force, it had to align with something real. Across town, Amara noticed the shifts, not because she was looking for them, but because awareness had always been part of her strength. She recognized patterns, the way a day repeated itself, the way consistency revealed intention. She saw the same car, once then again parked across the street, not approaching, not retreating, simply present, and she did not react immediately. She did not change her path or her pace because she had learned long ago that reaction gave power where it was not always deserved. Instead, she observed, allowing time to clarify what intention alone could not. Later that week, the sky stretched clear above the city, a soft blue uninterrupted by clouds, as Amara stood near the school entrance waiting for the children to finish their day. Her posture relaxed, her gaze steady. She saw the car again. This time, she did not look away immediately. She let her eyes rest on it just long enough to acknowledge what she already understood, and then she returned her attention to the doorway. When the children stepped out, they moved toward her with the same ease, the same trust, their voices blending into the air as they spoke over one another, sharing pieces of their day, small details that mattered because they belonged to them. She listened, fully present, fully engaged, her world defined by what stood in front of her, not by what remained across the street. Ethan saw that moment from a distance, the way she leaned slightly to meet them at their level, the way she listened without distraction, the way they reached for her without hesitation, and something in that simplicity settled deeper than any realization he had faced before. This was not a role, this was not something that could be learned quickly or performed. This was a life built over time, through presence, through patience, through showing up when it was not convenient, and staying when it was not easy. He stepped out of the car, then not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention. His movements measured, his pace unhurried as he crossed the street, each step grounded in the understanding that this moment did not belong to him, it belonged to them, and he was entering it as someone who had yet to earn his place. Amara noticed him before the children did, her gaze shifting slightly, her posture unchanged, because she had already decided she would not create a scene, she would not introduce tension where there was none, she would allow the moment to unfold as it needed to. Ethan stopped a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to retreat, his hands at his sides, his expression composed, but without the distance that once defined him. One of the children turned first, their eyes landing on him with curiosity rather than recognition, and in that single glance, there was no history, no expectation, just a question that had not yet been asked. Ethan did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to exist, not as hesitation, but as respect for the space he had stepped into. Amara met his gaze briefly, then looked down at the children, her voice calm, steady. "This is Ethan," she said, not adding more, not defining the relationship, not shaping their perception. She allowed it to be what it was, a name, a presence, nothing else. The children observed him quietly, one of them tilting their head slightly, as if studying a detail that did not yet make sense. Ethan lowered himself just enough to meet their height, his voice softer than it had ever been, in a boardroom, in a meeting, in any space where he had once commanded attention. "Hi," he said simply, no introduction, no explanation, because he understood that this moment was not about proving anything, it was about beginning something that had no guarantee. One of the children gave a small wave, another stepped half a step closer, not out of certainty, but out of curiosity, and in that small movement something shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to mark a beginning. Amara watched without interference, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, because this was not a moment she would control, it was one she would observe. Ethan remained there for only a few minutes, speaking little, listening more, his posture open, his tone measured, not trying to fill the silence, not trying to define what had not yet formed. And when he stepped back again, it was with the same awareness he had brought with him, not taking more than the moment allowed, not expecting more than what was given. "I will see you again," he said quietly, not to the children, not to Amara, but to the space itself, as if acknowledging a path rather than claiming it. And as he turned and walked back across the street, the distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like absence, it felt like something in progress, something that would not be rushed, not forced, but built one moment at a time. Time did not rush forward, it unfolded in quiet increments, marked by small, consistent moments that slowly reshaped what once felt impossible into something almost natural. Ethan returned again and again, never early, never late, always within the rhythm that had begun to form around the children's days. Sometimes he stood at a distance, sometimes he stepped closer, always measured, always aware that presence was not proven in grand gestures, but in repetition. The children began to notice him not as a stranger, but as a familiar outline within their routine, a figure who appeared without disruption, who spoke without demand, who listened more than he filled the space with words. One afternoon, the air carried a soft breeze, that moved gently through the trees lining the school courtyard. The children ran ahead of Amara, their laughter echoing lightly as they moved toward the bench near the entrance where they often paused before leaving. Ethan was already there this time. Not across the street, not in his car, but seated on the far end of the bench. His posture relaxed, his attention focused not on them directly, but on the space they would soon enter. When the children noticed him, their steps slowed slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. One of them glanced back at Amara, as if seeking confirmation. Without asking, she gave a small nod, her expression calm, unchanged, and that was enough. They approached him cautiously, curiosity guiding them more than certainty. Ethan stood as they came closer, not towering, not imposing, simply meeting them at their level, his voice steady. "Hi again," he said, and this time the greeting did not feel like an introduction, it felt like continuation. One of the children spoke first, their voice soft but clear. "You came back." The statement simple, yet carrying more meaning than any question could have. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I said I would," he replied, and the words settled differently now because they were not new, they were confirmed. Amara watched from a few steps behind, her presence quiet but constant, her gaze not fixed on Ethan, but on the children, allowing them the space to navigate this moment on their own terms. Another child stepped forward, holding something small in their hand, a drawing folded slightly at the edges. "We made these in class," they said, extending it toward him. Without hesitation, Ethan accepted it, carefully unfolding the paper, as if it carried more than just color and lines. It showed a simple house, 4 small figures standing together, and beside them a 5th figure drawn slightly apart, not fully connected, but not distant either. He studied it for a second, longer than necessary, not analyzing it, but feeling the space it represented. "It is beautiful," he said, his voice quieter than before, because he understood that this was not about the drawing, it was about what had been offered, without expectation, without condition. The children settled around the bench, their earlier hesitation replaced with a natural ease that came from familiarity, built slowly through repeated presence. Ethan listened as they spoke about their day, about small moments that held importance to them, things that did not require explanation, because they were lived, not performed. He responded, simply, never overreaching, never filling the silence unnecessarily, allowing the conversation to move at its own pace. Amara stepped closer, then not to intervene, but to be present within the same space, her gaze meeting Ethan's briefly, not questioning, not approving, simply acknowledging what was unfolding. And for the first time, there was no tension between them, no unspoken weight pressing against the moment, because this was not about them, it was about what existed in front of them and what might continue if it was allowed to grow without pressure. Without expectation, the afternoon light shifted slowly, casting longer shadows across the ground. As the moment reached its natural end, the children stood, gathering their things, their movements unhurried. Ethan rose as well, not lingering, not extending the moment beyond what it offered. "I will see you tomorrow," he said, this time directing the words gently toward them. One of the children smiled, another gave a small nod, and in that exchange something settled into place, not fully formed, not complete, but real. Amara turned to lead them away, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle difference in the way she moved, not a shift in trust, not yet, but an openness to what consistency might become. Ethan remained by the bench, watching as they walked away, the distance between them no longer defined by absence, but by time, by the space required for something meaningful to take root. And as the light faded into early evening, he understood that this was not a moment of redemption, it was a beginning that would ask for more than he had ever given before, and for the first time he was ready to give it without expecting anything in return. The rhythm held, and within that rhythm something deeper began to settle, not as a sudden shift, but as a quiet alignment that no longer needed to be questioned. Ethan did not miss a day, not because he felt obligated, but because absence no longer felt like an option. He arrived with the same measured presence each afternoon, sometimes early enough to watch the courtyard fill, sometimes just in time to meet the moment as it unfolded. And over time the children stopped noticing his arrival as something new. It became part of the pattern, the way the bell rang, the way the doors opened, the way the day transitioned into something softer, something. There's one afternoon the sky carried a soft gray tone, clouds stretching low and steady as a light breeze moved through the space, carrying the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. The children gathered near the bench again, their voices overlapping in easy conversation, one of them holding a small book, another tracing shapes along the edge of the seat. Ethan sat with them, not separate, not central, Just present. His posture relaxed, his attention grounded in what they were sharing, not distracted, not divided. When one of the children struggled to pronounce a word from the book, he did not correct immediately. He waited, letting them try again, letting the moment belong to them before offering a quiet suggestion. His tone gentle, his words simple, and when the child repeated it correctly, the smile that followed was not directed at him. It was directed inward, a small victory that needed no audience. Amara watched from a short distance away, her stance familiar, her presence steady, but there was a difference now, not in what she did, but in what she did not do. She did not monitor every exchange. She did not anticipate every outcome. She allowed space where space had been earned, not given freely, not carelessly, but through consistency, through time, through the absence of disruption. Later that afternoon, as the first drops of rain began to fall soft and scattered, the children moved closer together, instinctively seeking shelter beneath the overhang. Near the entrance, Ethan stood, then not hurried, not reactive, but aware, removing his jacket and holding it slightly above them, creating a small shield, not perfect, not necessary, but offered without thought. One of the children looked up at him, their expression curious. "You did not have to do that," they said, and his response came just as simply, "I know." The answer carried no expectation, no need for acknowledgement. It existed because it was chosen, not because it was required. Amara stepped forward, then closing the distance between them, not with hesitation, but with quiet intention. The rain grew steadier, tapping softly against the ground, the sound filling the space with a rhythm that matched the one they had built over time. She met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged yet not closed. "Thank you," she said, and the words were not dramatic, not heavy, they were clear, and that clarity mattered because it was not given lightly. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without turning it into something more, because he understood that meaning did not need to be expanded to be felt. The children shifted closer under the shared cover of the overhang, their voices softening as they watched the rain fall. One of them reached out, letting a drop land on their hand, then laughing quietly at the sensation, the moment simple, unremarkable to anyone passing by, yet within it something settled, something that no longer felt like transition but like presence, the kind that did not ask to be noticed because it was already there. When the rain began to ease, the light shifting once more through the clouds, the children stepped forward again, ready to continue their day. Ethan moved back slightly, giving them space, not retreating, not advancing, just aligning with what the moment required. Amara gathered their things, her movements fluid, her pace unchanged, and as they prepared to leave, she paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze resting on him. Not questioning, not measuring, just seeing. And in that look, there was something new, not trust, not yet, but recognition of what had been built through action rather than words. Ethan remained where he was, watching as they walked away, the distance between them now defined not by uncertainty, but by what had already begun to take shape. He did not follow, he did not call out, because he understood that what mattered was not how close he could stand in a single moment, but how consistently he could remain present across many. And as the last drops of rain disappeared into the pavement and the air cleared into something calm and open, he knew that this was no longer about repairing what had been lost. It was about honoring what was being allowed to grow one day at a time, without force, without expectation, just truth repeated until it became something that could no longer be questioned. The season shifted almost unnoticed, the air turning cooler, the light softer, as days grew shorter and routines settled deeper into something that no longer felt new. It felt lived, and the courtyard remained the same, yet everything within it had changed, not in structure, not in appearance, but in meaning. Ethan stood near the bench as he had done many times before, his presence no longer drawing quiet glances, no longer existing as an interruption. It had become part of the landscape, a constant that did not demand attention because it no longer needed to prove itself. The children approached him without hesitation, now their steps familiar, their voices open, the distance that once existed replaced by something simpler, something real. One of them reached for his hand, not out of uncertainty, but out of ease, the gesture small, unannounced, yet it carried a weight that could not be measured in words. Ethan did not react immediately. He allowed the moment to settle before closing his hand gently around theirs, not tightening, not claiming, just accepting the trust that had been given without condition. Amara watched from a few steps away, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but her stillness held something different now, not evaluation, not distance, but recognition, the kind that did not need to be spoken because it had already been built. Over time, she stepped forward, joining them, not as a barrier, not as a boundary, but as part of the same space the children moved between them, naturally, their conversation flowing without interruption, without awareness of the shift that had taken place, because to them it had not been a shift, it had been a process, one that unfolded at a pace that made sense to them, not to anyone else. The afternoon light stretched across the ground, casting long shadows that moved together rather than apart, the sound of their voices blending into the quiet rhythm of the day. One of the children looked up at Ethan, their expression thoughtful. "Are you coming tomorrow?" they asked, and the question carried no doubt, only expectation, the kind that had been formed through repetition. Ethan met their gaze, his answer simple but certain. "Yes," he said, and there was no need to add more, because the word had already been proven. Before Amara glanced at him briefly, not searching for confirmation, not measuring intention, just acknowledging what had already been shown, and in that moment something closed, not a door, not a possibility, but a chapter that no longer needed to remain open. The past did not disappear, it did not lose its place, but it no longer held authority over what stood in front of them. The children gathered their things, preparing to leave, their movements unhurried, their energy steady as they stepped forward. Together, Ethan moved with them, not ahead, not behind, just alongside, the balance, unspoken, yet understood. The street beyond the school stretched open, the city continuing its endless motion, cars passing, voices blending into the background of a world that never paused. And yet within that movement there was a space where everything felt aligned, not perfect, not resolved, but real. Amara adjusted the strap of her bag, her hand brushing lightly against one of the children's shoulders, her touch grounding them as they walked. She did not look back. She did not revisit what had been said, what had been done, because she no longer needed to. The truth had already been seen, and once seen, it did not require repetition. Ethan walked beside them, his pace steady, his presence no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he had chosen to build. He did not speak much. He did not try to fill the silence, because he understood now that presence was not about being heard. It was about being there consistently, without expectation, without demand. As they reached the corner where their paths would naturally separate, one of the children looked between them, their voice soft but clear. "We are all going the same way, right?" The question simple, yet it held something deeper, something that did not need to be explained. Amara paused for a brief moment, her gaze moving from the child to Ethan, then back again. And in that pause, there was no tension, no uncertainty, only clarity. "We are walking forward," she said, her voice calm, steady, and the words settled into the space around them, not as a promise, not as a resolution, but as a direction, the kind that did not depend on what had been left behind. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting the answer, not as something to define, but as something to honor. And as they continued down the street together, the distance between them no longer measured in steps, but in something far more meaningful, something built quietly over time, something that did not need to be declared, because it was already there. And in the fading light of the day, there was no grand ending, no dramatic closure, only a quiet truth that had found its place and remained there, steady, unshaken, no longer waiting to be seen.